So I'm just curious, in that setting, in those dark days of difficult things, what were you thinking about in terms of, was it just, I got to get out of this situation, or were you thinking about the destination of where you wanted to be?
I knew that if I kept putting one foot in front of the other,
Yeah.
I would eventually end up somewhere I needed to be. So what I was thinking, or what I was telling myself, was 3 children who had no say in coming to this earth, who had no responsibility for not having the financial resources or a house, deserved better. I can say I wish that I had parents or a parent that had put 5 kids first and made decisions based on 5 kids. We would have had a different life. However, without those tests, I wouldn't have a testimony at all. And so for me, it was look in the face of those little boys, and I felt like I had 2 jobs. One was teach them to be men, and I, as a female, in a really dysfunctional family, not having a good male role model, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to accomplish that. But teach them to be good men and teach them that they can accomplish anything, no matter how difficult it gets.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Ben and Sway Show. We've got another special guest for you today, Laura-Beth Christensen with Leverage Benefits Consulting. Unique thing is that you're from this area and you now live in the Seattle area.
Correct.
And you've worked in the Seattle area for a while. You grew up in Usk, Washington. There's a lot of people in Spokane who don't know where Usk is.
I know.
So it's just north of Newport along the Pondere River. I know because my family has a business there, and I grew up in Colville, so it's helpful to know those areas. So why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what you do.
Perfect. So I live in the Seattle area now. I've had the experience, though, of being exposed to several different areas. So Usk being one of them. From there, I was in a little town in Oregon, Cottage Grove. I did a small town in Texas, which is now pretty famous, Waco. I lived in Connecticut, in Groton, Connecticut, and then Helena, Montana, and then back over here to Spokane, and then over to Seattle. So.
Wow.
I've experienced a lot in a lot of areas, but small town and rural areas are really where I'm kind of the blood flow and the core of who I am.
Yeah. I think growing up in a small town, in a rural area, you know what to look for when you're in rural communities in terms of what's interesting. I think maybe, and I'd have to confess, didn't grow up in a city, so I'm just kind of projecting here, but I do think a lot of times people that live in cities and spend their time in cities, when they travel through rural areas, they just like, how would anybody ever live here? And this is like, there's nothing going on. But when you have that rural connection, I think, and there are people in the city that go out and then have a draw to the country, and they end up, a second home, or even moving out there when they retire. But I think for the most part, it's very helpful to have been there so you can appreciate both. I mean, I love the city too, and there's a lot of great things in all cities, but there's a lot of wonderful things in rural communities in rural America.
Yeah, I feel like there's a difference in my core and who I am. You remember those games that are the little boxes with the little silver bullet in there, the little BB, if you will, and you have to navigate it around to get it to the hole? That's what living in the city feels like to me. You're winding around the mouse, finding the trail. And when I'm back out in the country, it's more, most people would say they feel lost in the country. Where am I? Which way do I go? And suddenly I feel anchored. Yeah. It's what I know. And I think when you're connected to yourself and where you are, driving into Spokane and coming over from the west side, I suddenly breathe different. I look at these never-ending fields and feel at home.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your business now, what you do, what industries you're focused on, and that kind of thing.
It's an interesting thing. In a snapshot, I went to college at Seattle University and I got a degree in criminal justice. And I thought I would end up maybe in the FBI or CIA or something like that, possibly law school. From there, I ended up working in a men's institution as a lieutenant, so kind of running the facility. That's an interesting play. Mm-hmm. And then from there, in a homeless shelter, and I had the first Department of Justice program for trafficked humans that needed shelter. Wow. And then from there, on the backside, into county funding, so working in the government entity, funding those programs. And from there into benefits and benefit consulting. Ironically, people say to me, you're way off your target or your mark, what were you thinking? And for me, it comes full circle. So in the benefits arena, it's not just benefits that matter. And when we meet with companies, we're able to show them benefits aren't the only target for what you're looking to do when it comes to employees and business competence. And so now what we do for the last 10 years, I've been in the benefits world, primarily focused on manufacturing, aerospace, and lumber. And so I've been fortunate enough that we have about 400 clients at this point. And again, that thought of coming back home, interacting and being in a lumber plant or being in a manufacturing facility and talking with the employees and the business owners, I feel like I'm in the place where I belong.
Yeah. Well, I think that's very common, right? I think we see a lot of stories of successful people. Their story isn't usually A to B.
Right.
You know, it's I did this, and I may have crashed and burned here and done this, and then some circumstance brought this into my life, and now I'm doing exactly what I want to do and what I was meant to do.
Yeah. You have a friend that you had on one of your podcasts that talked about blowing up your life with the dynamite and then putting the pieces together. Yeah. I have experienced that a couple of times in life, and I can tell you I'm a much better person because of it, and I'm a better consultant for business owners because of it.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, you have a story, and I'm very grateful for your courage to share it, because I think a lot of people wouldn't share it. And if you haven't seen the YouTube video that you have out there that talks a little bit about your business, but really talks about your personal journey in life to get to the point where you could be successful for yourself and your family. Do you mind sharing a little bit of that about your road to where we are today?
Yeah, not at all. So I'm a huge advocate for educating people on homelessness and domestic violence. And what I know, September is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. What I know is that in rural communities, sometimes domestic violence is much more prevalent than we realize, and handled in a different way, because we all know the local sheriff or the police that will come to the house. So unfortunately, I grew up in a family that we were really rural. There was a lot of domestic violence in my household, and I observed or witnessed my mother being knocked out unconscious and my brother being knocked out unconscious, and just horrific violence. So I left home very, very early. I was a teen mom. They have a phrase that says, a girl who doesn't feel loved or accepted will go out looking for a hug and come back with a baby. Unfortunately, that was my situation, but fortunately, I am who I am today because of that situation. So I ended up in a really early marriage, young, with 3 children, and it also turned into a domestic violence situation. And I was different than a lot of the statistics will show, and said, not me. Not the cycle breaks here, the chains are broken here. And my grandparents and some of my friends said, you're crazy if you leave, there goes your meal ticket, how will you support 3 children? And I had a faith in myself somewhere. I didn't know that, but I believed it would be okay. So I lived in a car with 3 children. Unfortunately, that was the 4th quarter, so it was cold and snowing, and we were driving up and down the I-5 corridor in a small Honda Prelude, so if you remember those in the 80s. 2 doors and not a lot of room, and 3 kids, and I had one that was a bedwetter, so we called him the car wetter at that point. And it was a tough situation, and one night it was snowing and it was extremely cold, And I had a friend who said, you have a key to my apartment, you can come anytime. But it was a 2-bedroom apartment, and I had 3 kids, and she had a sister living with her. And I have always been the person who doesn't ask for help, who doesn't want to project my problems onto other people, and who doesn't want to be an inconvenience. And so I would never take people up on those offers. And so the night it was snowing, I decided I will. So I took my kids there, and they were sleeping on our floor, and they're about 2 in the morning. I didn't sleep much. When you're in that situation, it's very stressful. And I heard a loud noise outside her apartment, and I looked out, and it was a tow truck. And I realized she was my reference on my car loan for that car. And they had come that day looking to see if my car was there. And sure enough, they repossessed my car. And I had enrolled in school, and no one in my family had ever been to college. So I was in Highline Community College in basic entry-level classes, not knowing what I was doing. And I didn't have a choice but to take my kids to Texas and have them stay with family so that I could try to find us new housing. So it was a rude awakening.
Yeah.
Having run a homeless shelter and been a director of a homeless shelter in downtown Seattle, I can tell you that the vast majority of my clients have had similar experiences. My situation is not unique. There are a lot of women and men who have been homeless, who have had children, who have had to be separated from them, who have experienced domestic violence. But the difference for me was some of them end up turning to drugs or alcohol or some coping mechanism. And I simply chose what I call crawling through glass. No matter what it took, I was going to come out on top of that situation.
Yeah.
So I went to college every single day, whether I was homeless or not, whether I had a car or not, every single day for 5 years, and graduated cum laude from Seattle University.
That's awesome. I just got reintroduced to a piece from Earl Nightingale. Are you familiar with Earl
Yes.
Nightingale? He's like the great-grandfather of self-help, I guess you could say. But he said that the strangest secret is you are what you think about. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious, in that setting, in those dark days of difficult things, what were you thinking about? Where were you putting yourself? Where were you going? Because you obviously had a drive to crawl through the glass, if you will, to make it someplace else. Where were you going in your mind? What were you thinking about in terms of, was it just, I got to get out of this situation, or were you thinking about the destination of where you wanted to be?
These rural areas that we talk about that we're familiar with? Have you ever been out in those trees and in those fields at night in the dark? If you have a full moon like you will tonight, Friday the 13th and a full moon, you'll be able to navigate a little bit easier through those. On the nights where you go out and there's cloud cover and it's fall and it's dark, you don't really see where you're going.
Yeah.
I didn't really see where I was going. But I knew that if I kept putting one foot in front of the other, I would eventually end up somewhere I needed to be. So what I was thinking, or what I was telling myself, was 3 children who had no say in coming to this earth, who had no responsibility for not having the financial resources or a house, deserved better. I can say I wish that I had parents or a parent that had put 5 kids first and made decisions based on 5 kids. We would have had a different life. Mm-hmm. However, without those tests, I wouldn't have a testimony at all. And so for me, it was look in the face of those little boys, and I felt like I had 2 jobs. One was teach them to be men, and I, as a female, in a really dysfunctional family, not having a good male role model, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to accomplish that. But teach them to be good men and teach them that they can accomplish anything no matter how difficult it gets.
That's, it brings a different thought to my head, and that is, how do we, in this day and age, with so much prosperity, and you have a unique perspective on this, so how do we create the lessons when we have situations, and you see it all the time now, especially with millennials, that essentially get those tests removed from their life?
Yeah.
They get the opposite upbringing, right? They get everything was done, and their parents took care of everything for them, yet when they get in the real world, they get that smack in the face.
There's no one to rescue them.
Or and so how do we? 'Cause I hear everything you're saying. I see the challenges that you went through. I think we're always better when we go through challenges.
Absolutely.
But they don't have to be that drastic, let's hope.
Yeah.
You know, because I think that although you've come out of it and you're successful and you're doing these things and you've got lots of awards and the things that you've done, you probably could have taken a couple breaks of all the stuff you had to go through.
Yeah.
But I think removing every barrier has an opposite effect, where somebody can't deal with it, they're not hungry, they can't go after it, they don't think about the fact that they have to do this for their kids or that they have to do this for some other thing. How do you think, and this is way off topic, but how do you think that we deal with that? Like, you now have success in your life. You've instilled things. Your kids will have gone through a lot of those things and will still anchor those things in. But let's say you did your part and you raised these incredible boys. They become incredible men, and they have functional relationships, have kids, and they have a very comfortable life going forward. How did they instill the drive and the fortitude, if you will, into their children?
Yeah, that's a great thought process and question, and actually not so far off topic, because to be honest, when we're working with businesses, we're talking about how do you do things different than what's happening right now. And so those 3 boys of mine, the youngest one is a partner in my business with me. We started this business together.
That's wild.
So those boys are 36, 34, and 31.
Wow.
And I can tell you that there was this phrase I heard that's helicopter parenting.
Yeah.
That you're hovering over and you're trying to rescue. And I heard there's a new one now, and I don't know if you're familiar or if your listeners are familiar, but it's called lawnmower parenting. That you are right down on top of them and you are making sure that they're going through the path that you think that they should.
Yeah.
And I think it's a terrible mistake.
I do too.
Terrible mistake. I can tell you my kids have had some struggles. They've been through some things. And I was never able to really rescue some of the things that they went through. I was able to look at them and say there are natural consequences and I'll stand by you. I think we make a huge mistake when we rescue people from both the bumps and the bruises and the lesson to be learned in poor choices.
Yeah.
So bumps and bruises as an example. I was fortunate enough to go to Disneyland a couple weeks ago with my oldest, and he has 3 kids. And he's got one that's 8 years old, and he made a couple decisions to rescue his child, to protect him, make it easier for him. Just walking around, you're tired, and I made the comment, don't baby him. Yeah. And I could see it in this 36-year-old man's face. I'm not babying him. But I think parenting today, we would do better if we would let the kids go through some things that they're uncomfortable with.
Well, I think that's like it's the common thread amongst high achievers, I think. I mean, there's struggle, and you learn things from falling down. And I heard somebody say, I can't remember what it was, but it was like if you had to become a great ice skater, you have to fall down like 1,000 times. And so why don't we just get the skates on, jump up, and start falling down immediately? And get them out of the way. You know?
Well, and have we all seen the toddler that falls down and both parents or one parent jumps up with the and gasps and picks them up when we don't even know if the toddler's all right or not, but they're going to react in a way that says, when things are hard, someone's there to rescue me, and I should cry because it's too hard, and then let them rescue me, and that's not necessarily a good thing.
And I think that what we need to say is that it's all done for the right reasons. It just, I don't think, is thought out. Like, what happens 2 or 3 steps down the road, and then you have somebody that's, getting back to domestic violence and all that stuff. That stuff's enabled. Well, that can happen with really innocuous behavior as well. And so I think that it's something I think about. I mean, I'm a parent. My kids are 9, 8, and 10 months. So
fun.
The different side of the spectrum. But I think about that too, because we have the wherewithal to take care of our kids. and but they need to do things on their own. They need to be self-sufficient, because at some point, and we never know when that comes, we won't be there for them.
Right, and unfortunately in our society that could be as early as elementary school or middle school, where something's happening at school.
Yeah.
And have we taught them how to deal with conflict, and have we taught them how to manage stress and emotions, which in my world, everything I do, including the team that we have and the people that work with us and for us, we try to make sure that they understand just because something's difficult doesn't mean you stop.
Right.
But you have to navigate the emotion that comes with that.
Yeah.
And that all comes back to a 10-month-old. When that 10-month-old starts walking and falling down, you could take the approach of, let's sit back and see, how are we doing? Is there blood, or is it just frightening? Falling is frightening. I don't know if you've ever had that dream where you're up high and you're falling. Oh my gosh. It's scary, and falling in real life in business is scary, and falling in college is scary, and falling in relationships that don't work out is scary. But we wouldn't learn anything if everything we did was easy and there were no fear, in my opinion. Parenting today, I think we try to eliminate fear, and to your point, what do they do when they're out in the real world then and something's difficult?
Yeah.
Have we taught them to manage difficulties?
Well, and one of the things, in my company, Vaughan Timbers, fairness, integrity, and transparency are our core values. And I look at it like, if you do everything for your kids, how do you create that integrity to go out and do things, to be a successful person, successful in business? I think that all those things are interconnected because they're interpersonal relationships. Excuse me. But those interpersonal relationships, I think, translate into business as well.
Correct.
I don't see business leadership and employees as a parenting relationship. I think some people confuse that. I think, and I'd be really interested to get your take on it, but I see it as a leadership and service role, as being someone who has the responsibility and the privilege to have people work for them.
Yeah.
And I actually think it's kind of the opposite. You're more, in many cases, on the bottom rather than the top. And I think that's a healthy way to look at it. But talk a little bit about the way the most successful people that you interact with look at their employees and their whole human resource in general.
Stay tuned next week for part 2 of our Ben and Sway show with Laura-Beth Christensen.